Well, hello everyone and welcome to the Faithroots podcast. You can have a listen to this by audio, and that audio link is available from faithroots.com. It's also available on Anchor and Spotify. Some people, actually a smaller group, like to watch on YouTube, so it's available on YouTube as well. And I'm titling today's Faithroots podcast, I didn't realise we were in a competition. I didn't realise we were in a competition. And there's two reasons behind that title and behind what we're going to look at today. Here's the first one. Over the past month or two, I've been writing quite a bit about the cost of living crisis, trying to help us think biblically, think Christianly about how we respond as quite a lot of people within our communities, within our churches, are struggling with hardship. What is our responsibility as Christians? So that's part A. And you'll have seen some of the things that I've written about that. Secondly, I've also come back to the question of racism and systemic or structural or institutional racism over the past few days in response to some comments that have been made about the end of an evangelical conference in the States, where that's been blamed on some Christians becoming woke and promoting something called critical race theory. You can read an article on that I posted on Monday the 25th of April. That's available for you to read. But that sort of dovetails in because as I've responded and written, I'm also working through a book called Christianity and Wokeness by a guy called Owen Strachan, and I'll be writing some responses to that soon. Strachan is very critical of what he refers to as the woke movement, or those that are into critical race theory and anti-racism. I will be engaging with that. But as I've started to comment again and respond to some of the things there, some particular comments have come back. So the first one is this: should we talk about systemic racism as sin? Is there such a thing as systemic racism? Or is this something that Marxists have invented? Can we talk about it as sin? Or are we simply describing a situation where there is inequality? Where sometimes some people will have more and others will have less, when individuals and communities will do better than other individuals and communities. Is it sinful that happens? And is it sinful for Christians just to get on with their lives and not worry too much about that? Or are we only being godly and Christian when we say we do not accept that situation, and so we want to do something to turn it around? And in today's podcast, I'm not going to get into all of the details of how we approach the question of critical race theory, whether or not there is systemic racism, those kinds of things so much. I've written about them before. I'll be writing about them again. But I want to come to that question of whether or not we should expect and work for equality, or whether inequality, an unequal sharing of resources, is just the natural and reasonable consequences of how systems work, that any system will have unbalance and inequality built into it. That was one of the things that was suggested to me on social media, that any system will be unequal. It's unavoidable. It's going to happen, that there will be competition, that some will do better than others, that there will be a hierarchy. and we should just accept that. In fact, the suggestion made was that that's a good thing, that to push for equality, not just equality of opportunity, but equality of outcome, is actually in some way going against God's plan. And that's what I wanted to tackle today. Now, clearing some more ground. This is the sort of discussion that could take us into party politics. And I don't particularly want to go there if possible today. My aim is not to tell you whether or not you should be voting Conservative or Labour or Liberal Democrat if you're in the UK, or Democrat or Republican in the US, or whatever the party system is where you are. Whether or not to be a socialist or a conservative or capitalist. My view is this, just in terms of the politics, that there is nothing inherently unchristian, ungodly, unbiblical about voting for socialist type parties or implementing socialist type policies. I say that for any people from the US that are listening in, because there does tend to be a bias within evangelical circles in the US to see anything that is left-leaning, anything that is described as socialist. And by the way, a lot of stuff that is considered socialist in the US would probably be considered centrist or even centre-right in the UK. So that's one of the problems with these labels. But I have brothers and sisters who are socialist. My friend Steve Neal, who writes some blogs, and I sometimes refer to, is very overt in terms of saying his political position is a socialist one. And he comes to that position without going against biblical principles. In fact, if you were to ask Steve, I'm sure he would say, well, actually, I've reached my socialist position because I think that this is a good and helpful, in his opinion, the best way of following biblical principles. Interestingly, in the United Kingdom, I think it might have been possibly Malcolm Muggeridge or even Tony Bennett. It's something that's been actually said by lots of people. It has often been commented that British socialism, and particularly the British Labour movement, owes as much, if not more, to Methodism than to Marxism. So let's get that out of the way. Probably for British audiences, British evangelical audiences, I need to emphasise the other side of things. That it is perfectly possible and legitimate, fine, to be a Christian and to vote for centre-right, capitalist type, free market type parties, to vote for, so it's fine to be a Christian and vote Labour, it's fine to be a Christian and vote Conservative. There may be particular times when you have an issue with the party at the time. So I'm not talking about a specific instance. I said in 2019 that I couldn't, in good conscience, vote for either option. And I've written and talked about why that was so previously. But over time, over history, that's your democratic decision. And there are lots of people who would say, I'm likely to be involved in conservative, centre-right type politics because I find that they are, in my opinion, the best way of following biblical principles. In fact, my leaning has been what you might refer to as centre-right. I personally would struggle with socialism. Why? Not because I think that a concern for the poor is wrong, not because I think that, and we're coming to this in a minute, that inequality is something that is fine. I think that we should be seeking to share equally and well. Now, my reservations are really with the ability of the government, of the state, particularly centrally, to intervene in a helpful way, in a way that doesn't become controlling, in a way that does make a difference for good. So my suspicion is I guess really of the big state, of big government, of high taxation and that kind of thing, of lots of regulation. As on my leaning is to say I would prefer the state not to be heavily involved in people's lives. People should be allowed to run their own businesses, do their own work, make their own decisions about what they do with their resources. Now, that's my personal opinion, and I think therefore that if you are a Christian, and if you are seeking to follow God's word, then actually you're going to be able to better pursue those principles of love and compassion and care without the heavy hand of the state, of the government on you. Those are differences that you will find amongst Christians, and we can debate them out. Maybe one day I will get somebody like Steve on the podcast and we'll debate some of those things out. Who knows? Well, having said all of that, I want to now talk about this question of equality. And you'll notice that I've already referred to a distinction there. When we talk about equality, do we mean equality of opportunity or equality of outcome? Equality of opportunity means that you and I, everyone around us, has the same opportunity to participate in life. That we have the same crack at the whip, the same chances. Equality of outcome means that the result should be the same for everyone. So equality of opportunity in terms of education will mean that all of us should be able to have access to education, to good quality education. Equality of outcome would be that we should all get the same grade. Equality of opportunity for jobs means that you, I, anyone should be able to apply for a job. Equality of outcome, and that's where you start to see the problem with this, would mean we all should get the job. Now, it's a little bit more complicated than that when we talk about equality of opportunity, isn't it? Because if I say that we have all got the same opportunity to have a go at something, but in fact there are barriers up, then do we have the same opportunity? If I put a box of chocolates on a table in the middle of a room, and we're all stood out at a distance from it, and I say, go. And the first person to get to that box of chocolates gets to keep it. Do we have equality of opportunity? Equality of outcome would mean it didn't matter who got there. We should all share the chocolates together. And maybe we shouldn't have put it on a table in the middle of the room and made us run for it in the first place. But equality of opportunity, is it equal? Well, what if we all stand at the outside of the room, but I intentionally put some obstacles in the way of one of you? I put a chair in front of you. I've positioned you so that there is a big hole in the ground that you've got to either go around or fall into. I've nailed your trainers to the floor, all those kinds of things. I would have put barriers up. Is it equality of opportunity? Well, I think at that point you'd say, no, Dave, it's not, is it? You've put a hindrance in the way of one person. So as a minimum, if we want equality of opportunity, we're going to have to remove those barriers. It's either that or we put the same barriers up in front of everyone else. I don't know which one I would prefer. But what if other people that are in this competition to get to the box of chocolates were hindered, not by barriers that I put in the way, but by just other circumstances? What if one of you had sprained your ankle and couldn't move so quickly? What if one of you, like me, were visually impaired but didn't have your glasses with you to help you? What if you were the sort of person that got anxious and froze? And as soon as the race started, perhaps, if we started with a starter gun or just the noise of other people caused you to freeze, would you have the same opportunity then? Now, as you're listening in, some of you will be thinking, yeah, you've got the same opportunity. It's not the fault of the person that organised the competition. That's just life. That's just circumstances. Others would be saying, well, actually, no, we do want that isn't a level playing field. So some of you, it's the debate in athletics and sports at the moment, isn't it? Some of you would say, well, we need different types of competition for people with different levels of fitness and physicality and those kinds of things. Some of you would say we need to do things that actually level the playing field so we're all competing together, but perhaps some people need to be closer in. And all of that is about equality of opportunity. Now, at the moment, we're thinking in terms of a competition, and this, very clearly is a game with a reward, with a prize. So fair enough. And in the end, box of chocolates doesn't matter that much, does it? But what if I said, instead of it being a box of chocolates on the table in the middle of the room, what if I said it was dinner? What if I'd invited you all to my house? And then I'd said, dinner is served, but it's first come, first served. First to get to that table eats the dinner. What do you say then? I think at that stage you would ask my question, you would make my statement. I didn't realise this was a competition. And that, I believe, is the crucial question. Is life meant to be set up as a competition? Now, this is not a question about whether or not we should have competitions. Whether or not we think that there should just be prizes for everyone, and like sports and games and league tables and all those kinds of things are a bad thing. I enjoy sport more watching than participating. But I know that means it's a competition, and that the excitement is seeing who will win the competition, or it should be, unless you're a Bradford City fan, in which case you know that you are never going to win the competition. Fair enough. But the question is not about whether there should be competition. Rather, it's about whether life itself, whether or not being part of society is a competition. Is our expectation really that there is some kind of competition in terms of having a roof over your head, having enough food to eat, enough water to drink, having the resources for a good life? Is there a competition in terms of relationships, in terms of love and affection? Is that what it's meant to be like? And at times, that is how life seems to be, isn't it? Because we're competing over resources, often scarce resources, where there doesn't seem to be enough to go around equally. But is that what life was meant to be like? Or has that inequality, not just of opportunity but of outcome, been caused by something else? That's where our biblical and our systematic theology comes in. Because I want to suggest that the people who are saying that any system means that there's going to be inequality, unequal sharing of resources, is making the mistake of looking at the world as it is now and saying that's how it ought to be. The is becomes an ought. And that's dangerous, because it fails to recognise that we live in a world that is subjected to corruption because of the fall. So God made this perfect, wonderful, good world. He made all the animals, and he made humans, and told us to rule over the world as humans, to rule over all of the creation, to subdue it and to fill it. And that idea of being able to multiply and to fill out and subdue the world suggests luxurious, abundant plenty. That we would all be able to enjoy and to share this planet together. Now, fascinatingly, even post the fall, in terms of the natural resources available on the planet, there probably is enough for us to be able to all live without worry about starvation. That we should all have that sense that there is enough to go around. Even after sin entered the world, even after judgment and curse came, even after thousands of years, that's still the case. So I want to say that God's intent, when you look at Genesis, seems to be that all humanity will be able to share in and to enjoy together. And as we're going to see in a minute, there's some further clues about that. In fact, let's go to that now. What are the further clues? Well, the further clues are when we start to look at God's people, the people of Israel, and what was asked of them. What was God's expectation, and what was God's promise for them as a people? Because we see with the people of Israel just this image of kind of what the whole of creation was meant to be like, what it's meant to be like for God's people to live in God's place, God's land, under God's reign. What do we see? Well, here are a couple of clues. Leviticus 25. I'm going to read quite a bit of scripture here. Leviticus 25. The Lord spoke to Moses on Mount Sinai, saying, "Speak to the people of Israel and say to them, when you come into the land that I give you, the land shall keep a Sabbath to the Lord. For 6 years you shall sow your field, and for 6 years you shall prune your vineyard and gather in its fruits. But in the 7th year there shall be a Sabbath of solemn rest for the land, a Sabbath to the Lord. You shall not sow your field or prune your vineyard. You shall not reap what grows of itself in your harvest, or gather the grapes of your undressed vine. It shall be a year of solemn rest for the land. The Sabbath of the land shall provide food for you, for yourself, and for your male and female slaves, and for your hired worker and the sojourner who lives with you, and for your cattle and for the wild animals that are in your land. All its yield shall be for food. But you shall count 7 weeks of years, 7 times 7 years, so that the time of the 7 weeks of years shall give you 49 years. Then you shall sound the loud trumpet on the 10th day of the 7th month. On the day of atonement you shall sound the trumpet throughout all your land, and you shall consecrate the 50th year, and proclaim liberty throughout the land to all its inhabitants. It shall be a jubilee for you, when each of you shall return to his property, and each of you shall return to his clan. That 50th year shall be a jubilee for you. In it you shall neither sow nor reap what grows of itself, nor gather the grapes from the undressed vines. For it is a jubilee, it shall be holy to you. You may eat the produce of the field. In this year of jubilee, each of you shall return to his property. And if you make a sale to your neighbour, or buy from your neighbour, you shall not wrong one another. You shall pay your neighbour according to the number of years after the jubilee, and he shall sell to you according to the number of years for crops. If the years are many, you shall increase the price, and if the years are few, you shall reduce the price. For it is the number of the crops that he is selling to you. You shall not wrong one another, but you shall fear your God, for I am the Lord your God." And here is Deuteronomy 15, also talking about the Sabbath year. Deuteronomy 15 verse 1. "At the end of every 7 years you shall grant a release, and this is the manner of the release. Every creditor shall release what he has lent to his neighbour. He shall not exact it of his neighbour, his brother, because the Lord's release has been proclaimed. Of a foreigner you may exact it, but whatever of yours is with your brother, your hand shall release. But there will be no poor among you, for the Lord your God will bless you in the land that the Lord your God is giving you for an inheritance to possess. If only you will strictly obey the voice of the Lord your God, being careful to do all this commandment that I command you today." So here we have a pattern of life for the people of Israel. Now, because this is given to the people of Israel in their land, in their context, I don't think that we can just simply overlay those laws onto modern day Britain or modern day America or Tanzania or Nigeria or Indonesia or China or Australia or wherever you're listening in from. But we start to see something there about what it means to be God's people. And you'll have picked up on a phrase there in the Deuteronomy passage that God through Moses says to the people that when they get into the land there should be no poor among them, because God is going to bless them. Just as that blessing was meant to be for all creation, now for God's people there's this enjoyment of blessing in his land, in his place. He's going to provide for them. But it depends on them living in the way that God says. And that's what we've seen in both these passages. That God builds in this principle of rest, of pause. The Sabbath year every 7 years, and then 7 times 7, and then the year after you have the Jubilee, a double Sabbath, a Sabbath of Sabbaths, where it's experienced on an even bigger scale. And by saying stop, Don't sow and plant for that year. What God is saying is, first of all, learn to trust me to provide. That there will be enough in the other 6 years to enable you to provide for the 7th year. What God is saying is that we don't have to be just hell-bent for leather to exploit the land, to exploit the creation to get ahead. And then what you notice is that there is a resetting. That for the people of Israel, owning property and buying and acquiring property doesn't seem to have been a permanent thing, that it was meant to return to the original people, the original clans, the original families, the original tribes. So that rather than someone, a bit like, Elon Musk is amassing shares, taking over Twitter. No, the idea wasn't that you could build up a permanent monopoly to take over the land. The land was meant to be shared out. If somebody was in debt to you, then they are released from that debt in the 7th year, so that you are not holding that debt over them, so that they are not constantly having to repay you. And if somebody is coming to your service in servitude, maybe to pay off a debt that way, then you can't keep them as a permanent slave. They are set free. Those are the principles that are in place. And the crucial implication of it is this: that there isn't meant to be a small group of people that are able to take control and to exploit and to benefit from others and to just amass to themselves possessions, wealth and power. That's not how God's people are meant to operate in God's land. There is meant to be that sense of sharing. And there are lots of other ways in the law, the requirement to leave part of the field, part of the harvest for the gleaners to come, the kinsman redeemer principle, all of those things are ways of saying that the expectation is that you share in together. This is not a competition. Now that is the Old Testament. That's the law specific to Israel. And as I said, I'm not saying that gives us a political or economic program for our countries today. What it does do is it gives us a feel for what life should be like, what life will be like in the new creation. And there's also a feel for that given, I think, in what happens in the New Testament. You see it, there is a concern for one another in the church. They even hold everything in common, Acts 2. But also we have these words in Romans chapter 12. Romans 12 verse 10 says, "Be devoted to one another in love, honour or prefer one another above yourselves." So there, in terms of the church, how we see each other in the church means that we are not meant to think in terms of competition with each other. It's not a competition. Incidentally, a little side note there, that means that in terms of those of us involved in gospel ministry, that there isn't a competition. It's not about who can plant the most churches or get the most converts or have the largest church or speak to the biggest audiences or sell the most books or get the most blog followers. No, spiritually we are meant to share in the joy of the work and the joy of fruitfulness together. But it also again helps us to think about what life is meant to be like. Now, most of us, there is little that we can do to actually challenge and change the reality of the world around us. And I think for most of us, simply our responsibility is to say, in terms of how we live our lives, and particularly how we live our lives in the church community, we want to demonstrate a different way of living. A way of living where, in our mind, we're not thinking in terms of the competition, who can get to the box of chocolates first, but our mindset, our paradigm is the family are being invited to eat together. There may, though, be opportunities and times when we're able to speak, to challenge, or even if you go into things like politics, to act, to say there's a different way of doing things. That life is not meant to be a competition. That rather, life is meant to be about enjoying God's goodness and looking after His creation for Him. So I want to encourage you just to think about those things. Think about your own church and your own life. The ways that you can live out those principles in terms of how you live, how you act, and how your church functions. Maybe something to discuss and bounce with others. But thanks for listening in. Enjoy your week.